I suggest that the view of reality represented in these beliefs is deeply, deeply flawed, and it also underlies a system of economics that begins by defining the basic economic problem that drives all of economic progress as the gap between what we have and what we want. Not need, want. This is the first lesson of Economics 101. And the economists tell us we can never close that gap. Whatever we have, we will always want more, and that gap drives all economic progress. It's also a system that worships at the shrine of growth without due consideration for what should grow and what should not grow. And it's a system that ignores the externalities, the cost to society and to innocent third parties that are so inherent in so many of the transactions that it fosters, as it establishes prices solely on the basis of supply and demand without regard for true costs. This, of course, renders the invisible hand blind as a bat in its allocation of resources as it stumbles along in its blindness, ignoring the consequences of its actions that are represented by the externalities it creates. When we stand back and we look at this system and the mindset of the worldview that underlies it, we cannot avoid the inevitable conclusion. This system that takes from the earth whatever it wants to produce products that quickly end up in landfills and incinerators, think pollution, wastes vast amount of resources all along the way, and does all of this with total indifference to societal costs, simply cannot go on and on and on. We humans cannot build a true long-range future on this economic model. Its days of necessity are numbered because the industrial system that stems from this worldview is destroying the biosphere that undergirds the system itself. For you tell me, what company, what economy can survive without air, without clean water, food, energy, materials, climate regulation, an ultraviolet radiation shield, pollination, seed dispersal, flood and insect control, water purification and distribution through the hydrologic cycle, nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, and more, all provided by nature. Without any of these, there would be very little economy at all. Nature truly is the goose that lays all the golden eggs, and like the goose in Jack and the Beanstalk, nature is being squeezed to death. If this is the state in which we and the technosphere, the industrial system, and ourselves now find ourselves, where must we go from here and how? For starters, we must find a way to rewrite the Ehrlich impact equation, to break its iron grip and move technology to the denominator. I equal P times A divided by T. Then technology would reduce environmental impacts and become part of the solution instead of a major contributor to the problem. The mathematically minded will see it immediately. The bigger T becomes in the denominator, the smaller the environmental impacts become. I suggest that the underlying mindset, this paradigm, the view of reality, must change. The old flawed mindset born of the 18th century must be replaced by a new mindset that acknowledges that the earth is finite as a source and a sink. We can see it from space. That is it. Humankind was made for earth, not the other way around. The earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. The blind, invisible hand of the market is a dishonest, opportunistic broker. It will foist any cost on society that an unwary or uncaring public will allow it to. It must constantly be redressed to keep it honest, to give it sight. Business exists to make a profit? I beg to differ. Business makes a profit to exist, not the other way around, and it must surely exist for some higher purpose given its pervasive global reach and its power for good or evil. What CEO really expects to stand before her or his maker someday and talk about shareholder value? And what about technologies? Technologies that are extractive, linear, take, make, waste, driven by fossil fuels, wasteful, abusive, and focused on labor productivity, emanating from a flawed mindset, are inherently unsustainable. They do belong in the numerator where they multiply environmental degradation. To move to the denominator and become part of the solution, technologies must evolve to become renewable. I equal P times A divided by T2. This is the new test for the viability and suitability of technologies in a sustainable industrial system and in the corporation of the future. These T2 technologies can also put people, no longer scarce, but today an overly abundant resource, to work, and in ways that conserve nature, which is now the scarce and diminishing resource here in the 21st century. And in case you're wondering, can a company do all this and not go broke, see the last two metrics. Sales increased 60% since 1996, spanning the worst recession in our industry's entire history, and profits doubled. Now, so let me summarize the business case for you. Costs are down, not up, dispelling that myth and the false choice between economy and environment. The waste elimination effort alone, the $405 million, have driven overall costs down, not up. Products are better than they have ever been. Sustainable design is a wellspring of innovation, especially biomimicry. Our people are galvanized around this shared higher purpose. And the goodwill of the marketplace is greater than any amount of advertising or clever marketing at any cost could have created. It is, believe me, that goodwill is earned every day by doing this stuff, not by just talking about it. It is a better way to make a more legitimate profit, a better business model, better for the planet and better for the shareholders. At best, though, humanity without doubt faces a transition in which the equation will read I equal P times A times T1 divided by T2, where T1 represents those unsustainable technologies hanging on, and 2 represents the sustainable technologies. But over time, T1 must give way to T2 until eventually only T2 is left if we are to have a sustainable industrial system. But can humanity realize a sustainable society even if the entire industrial system eventually operates within this revised Ehrlich equation? I think not. For affluence is still represented by a capital A, suggesting that affluence is an end in itself, perhaps the end. And this just seems entirely too consistent with the old definition of the basic economic problem, the gap between what we have and what we want. What if, however, Homo sapiens matured as a species to the point that the basic economic problem were redefined as the gap between what we have and what we need? What if that resulted from a reordering of priorities for individuals and society so that affluence could be represented by a lowercase a, suggesting it to be a means to an end rather than the end in itself? And what if the true end we all seek, happiness, were injected into a further revised Ehrlich equation? P times lowercase a divided by T2 times capital H for happiness. Happiness coming from satisfying all basic human needs. More happiness with less stuff. The last major variable, population P, remains, but actually may not be as independent a variable as it seems in the equation. The forces that give rise to modified affluence and greater happiness, in particular the education of women around the world, may very well influence population to a lower peak level than the current UN projection of some 9 billion people indicates. But as I said in the beginning, that's a discussion for another day. Thank you. You've been a great audience.